Hello everyone, RJM3 here. Welcome back to What If, the alternate history series where I speculate what could have been if history had gone differently. From the early to mid-19th century, the United States was overtaken by the idea of manifest destiny, the idea that it was America's God-given right to relentlessly expand westward to span the entire length of the North American continent, from Atlantic to Pacific. However, this ambitious undertaking would be challenged by many, including the native peoples, the British Empire, and of course, Mexico. Following its independence from the Spanish Empire in 1821, Mexico acquired a rather large empire itself, stretching from California to Costa Rica. However, the northern part of Mexico, El Norte, was far too sparsely populated, hardly had any infrastructure, was frequently raided by native tribes, and overall economically unproductive. Unfortunately, no Mexican residents in the populated heart of the country wanted to move to the north and help develop those areas. Can't really blame them though. So, to remedy this problem, Mexican oligarchs invited American settlers to migrate to the northern province of Texas. Now, obviously, this was a very terrible idea, as these American settlers, who clearly held no loyalty to Mexico, didn't really care about helping Mexico. While they certainly helped grow Texas's economy and infrastructure, Texas became increasingly less economically integrated with Mexico and more integrated with the United States via trade. These American settlers were inspired by the ideas of manifest destiny and freedom from tyranny, and alongside Texas's small Mexican population, the Tejanos, they practically ignored every single decree coming from Mexico City, from the unreasonable laws that restricted trade and prevented the poor from running for political office, to the not-so-unreasonable law that prohibited slavery. In October 1835, after Mexican conservative leaders reformed Mexico into a unitary political regime, a series of rebellions broke out across the country. Most famously of all was the rebellion in Texas, in which the Americans and the Tejanos declared their own country, the Republic of Texas. Following the famous last stand at the Alamo and the Texan victory at the Battle of San Jacinto, Texan independence was secured in April 1836. However, Mexico would bitterly refuse to recognize Texas's independence for another decade. After kicking the Tejanos to the curb, Texas immediately requested to be annexed by the United States. But then President Martin Van Buren thought that admitting Texas into the Union, most certainly as a slave state, would spark outrage among the anti-slavery Whigs in the North. He also feared such action would provoke a war with Mexico, so Texas's initial request was rejected and the issue of Texan statehood was kicked down the road. But in 1844, James K. Polk, the former governor of Tennessee and a firm believer in manifest destiny, was elected president. Upon his inauguration, Texas was welcomed into the Union with open arms, becoming the 28th state on December 29, 1845. But there was a problem. Texas had a border dispute with Mexico between the Rio Grande and the Rio Nueces, which the U.S. now inherited. And on top of that, because Mexico never recognized Texan independence, from their perspective, the U.S. just annexed Mexican territory. As that was happening, President Polk sent diplomat John Slidell to Mexico to convince their government to recognize the border along the Rio Grande, as well as to offer to purchase the territories of Alta California and Nuevo Mexico in exchange for a generous sum of $25 million. While then Mexican President Jose Joaquin de Herrera was willing to negotiate to hopefully keep at least some of the land America wanted, the idea of settling things peacefully and pragmatically deeply upset the fiercely jingoistic Mexican oligarchs, who rebelled and forced Herrera to resign, sending the government into chaos and leaving Mexico unable to negotiate. With negotiations going nowhere, Polk decided to pull a pro-gamer move. In March 1846, Polk sent an army led by General and future President Zachary Taylor into the disputed territory, hoping Mexico would retaliate and give him the excuse he needed to go to war. After arriving in the disputed territory, Mexican General Pedro de Ampudia demanded the army go back behind the Rio Nueces, which they refused. And so the Mexicans, despite knowing full well that this was obvious bait to start a war, struck first and gave Polk exactly what he wanted. On May 13, 1846, Congress issued a declaration of war on Mexico, starting the Mexican-American War. Because of the United States having the benefits of abundant resources, some industrialization, a better equipped and well-organized army, and most importantly, a functioning government, the war was basically a curb stomp. In the peace treaty that followed, Mexico was finally forced to recognize American control of Texas and the border on the Rio Grande, while the United States was able to annex Nuevo Mexico and Alta California, the latter of which would prove to be quite beneficial as the discovery of gold in the region motivated even more Americans to travel west and find their fortune. Mexico, on the other hand, would continue on its downward spiral, with the outbreak of a civil war between liberals and conservatives just a decade later, followed by an invasion by France, a massive revolution at the turn of the 20th century, and the eventual domination of the drug cartels, corruption, and instability all across the board, which America almost always gets the blame for depriving Mexico of California's gold supply. More on that later. As for Polk, he willingly left office after serving only one term, honoring a promise he made to his fellow Democrats before his election. But just a few months after leaving office, Polk died from what was most likely cholera, being the only president in U.S. history to have fulfilled all of his campaign promises. In 1853, the U.S. purchased this land from Mexico for $10 million, completing the U.S.-Mexico border we all know and love today. Well, unless you're Johnny Harris, that is. But did it have to be this way? Could Mexico have been able to avoid such a tremendous loss? Could Mexico have held on to all, if not most, of its northern territories? Could Manifest Destiny have been stopped? Since the notion of Mexico outright winning the war is clearly out of the question, perhaps it would be better to ask, what if the Mexican-American War never happened? A good initial point of divergence for this scenario to work could have the Mexican government never inviting American settlers into Texas. Instead, the issue of El Norte's scarce population is handled the same way the Mexican government of today handles all of its problems, by ignoring it completely. Considering how the Americans in Texas didn't contribute to the Mexican economy in our timeline, Mexico's situation isn't actually made any worse by this decision. But when Mexico still centralizes in 1835 and a series of rebellions still break out across the country, Texas still breaks away from Mexico. Except this time, it's a revolution kickstarted not primarily by American settlers, but solely by the Tejanos. The Tejanos already had a long history of a free, independent frontier spirit and defiance of any central authority, whether it be the Mexican government or the Spanish Empire. So it isn't too much of a stretch to suggest that the Tejanos would have launched a revolution without American help in response to Mexican unitarism and further encroachment of their rights. They would create a new, free-spirited country on the frontier, the Republic of Texas. However, without the much larger population of American settlers, not only is the revolution itself delayed by a couple of years or so, but the fighting itself is far more drawn out and much harder for the defenders. Given the track record for all of the other rebellions in Mexico after centralization, the Tejanos would eventually be defeated as well, but the dream of an independent Texas would still persist in the hearts and minds of the locals after the revolution. 1844. Now, Polk and a large portion of the US population, particularly in the slaveholding South, would still be interested in taking territory from Mexico, either by purchasing it or by force if necessary, regardless of what happens in Texas. So, to further hinder America's Western ambitions, I suggest the tried and true alternate history trope of simply reversing the outcome of a presidential election. In the 1844 election, Polk's opponent was Henry Clay of the Whig Party, a former senator from Kentucky, former Speaker of the House, and former Secretary of State. Contrary to Polk, Clay was opposed to annexing Texas, so if Clay is elected instead, tensions will not escalate between the US and Mexico as long as he remains in office. And the best part is, only one closely contested state needs to be flipped to get this outcome: New York. Now, during Clay's political career in our timeline, he was known as the Great Compromiser for his work in resolving disputes between the free states and the slave states, such as the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. So upon entering office, to calm the nerves of irritated slaveholders who were prevented from expanding westward, President Clay permits new slave states to be created in the Midwest, overriding the Missouri Compromise. Meanwhile, the Oregon Territory is split between the US and the British Empire on the 49th parallel, just like in our timeline. But not like our timeline, James W. Marshall doesn't move to California to oversee the construction of a sawmill after his brief service in the Mexican-American War, and he never becomes the first man to discover gold in the region on January 24, 1848, preventing the California Gold Rush. But eventually, sooner or later, someone, whether they be Mexican or American, will inevitably stumble upon gold in California, and when that happens, American interest in Mexican soil will be reinvigorated. Everything that's been changed so far, the Texas Revolution, the 1844 election, those were just half measures that simply delayed the war. No more half measures, my dear viewers. One more change must be made to history to ensure Mexico never comes into conflict with the U.S. The Pig War. When the Oregon Territory was split between the United States and the British Empire, it wasn't clarified if the San Juan Islands in between Vancouver Island and modern-day Washington State belonged to Britain or America. This became a strong point of contention between the two powers, as settlers from both sides occupied the islands. This contention crescendoed in the summer of 1859, when an American settler shot a pig owned by a British settler. The ensuing escalation very nearly brought the US and the UK to war for the third time in a century. But fortunately, cooler heads on both sides de-escalated the situation, agreeing to a joint occupation of the San Juan Islands, which lasted until 1872, when it was decided that the United States would control the islands. But in this alternate timeline, as the final point of divergence, the Pig War escalates into an actual conflict between the United States and the British Empire. Now, perhaps at a much later point in the 19th century, the US could have decisively defeated the British, but it's important to note that the whole Pig War incident happened dangerously close to the start of the American Civil War. While one could argue that the outbreak of a war with Britain could have renewed a sense of patriotism among the southern states, unifying the country until Britain is defeated and delaying the Civil War for many more years, one could also argue that a war with Britain in 1859 would have accelerated the outbreak of the Civil War. It's very possible many Southern political leaders were already waiting for an excuse or an opportunity to leave the Union by this point, and a war with Britain could appear to be a good enough distraction for the South to leave. The war could also be perceived by the South as the North wanted to annex Canada to create more free states. This perception could be made even more prominent by the fact that the South hadn't been allowed to expand into Mexico in this alternate timeline. For the sake of this video, let's just assume that the latter scenario is true and the American Civil War breaks out ahead of schedule. Frustrated by the perceived power imbalance in the Union, several southern states secede and form the Confederacy. And what would have been the border states in our timeline, many wealthy slave-owning Southerners who would have otherwise moved to Texas influenced these states to join the Confederacy. The United States is forced to fight a war on two fronts, and if the Germans have taught us anything, that is not a recipe for success. The Union is eventually beaten, partitioned, and a shell of its former self. Now, let's finally talk about Mexico. Without the Mexican-American War, the Centralist Republic established in 1835 never collapses, as President Herrera is never overthrown, and Mexican liberals are never given an opportunity to re-federalize Mexico in the ensuing upheaval. With the liberals out of power, they can't limit the role of the Catholic Church in Mexican society, and so the ensuing Reform War fought between the liberals and the conservatives doesn't break out in 1858. Shortly after the US is defeated in the early 1860s, gold is quickly and conveniently discovered in California. So Mexico is rich and can finally become a stable first world country now, right?
No, you silly livers! No!
You see, Mexico is different from the United States on a very fundamental level. The British Empire administered the 13 colonies fairly lightly, as the Crown had to frequently cooperate and compromise with the colonists. Settlers were allowed to own their own land, to practice their own religion, and to petition the local government. The result was a liberal society held up by strong institutions based on cooperation, not coercion. So when the Crown stopped seeing eye to eye with the colonists, who then decided to start their own country, the institutions and cultural norms previously established allowed the Founding Fathers to create a stable society based on the rule of law that was able to grow and expand political and civil rights and generate new prosperity for all. The Spanish Empire, on the other hand, were particularly terrible colonial administrators when compared to their contemporaries. In their American colonies, they imposed an incredibly rigid social hierarchy that makes feudalism from the Middle Ages seem democratic by comparison, one that accounted for social status, race, and even place of birth. Property rights were limited to a wealthy, powerful few, religious freedom was non-existent, and the common people had no say in any of it. This hierarchy essentially suffocated justice and allowed corruption to thrive in the political and legal institutions set up by the Spanish across Latin America. When Mexico and the rest of Spain's American colonies won their independence in the early 19th century, they inherited those same corrupted institutions. This isn't a problem you can just throw money at. Saudi Arabia is certainly rich in black gold, but that didn't stop them from becoming a repressive dictatorship, did it? While it's nice to imagine families all across Mexico packing their belongings and setting off to California in search of gold, eventually striking it rich and generating new prosperity for the whole country to indulge in, just like the United States in our timeline, it's little more than a pipe dream. In reality, Mexican oligarchs would just buy up much of the land in California where gold can be found, as well as heavily tax any ordinary Mexican who did manage to find gold, or perhaps even go as far as to hire private militias to shoot at anyone else trying to mine in the area. Every last ounce of gold would be hoarded by the rich and powerful, and the common Mexican would be left with nothing. This is why it doesn't make sense to blame Mexico's current state on America. It pins all of the blame for Mexico's woes on some caricature and glosses over a much more complex truth. The groundwork for Mexico's systemic ruin was laid out centuries before either country was even founded. The fact of the matter is, the United States was able to get more use out of the land it took in the war than Mexico ever could have. In fact, not only would the gold in California fail to help the Mexican people in any meaningful way, it might only serve to ruin Mexico even further, becoming the catalyst for an alternate reform war later on. Rather than being caused by the conservatives trying to restore the power of the church, it could have been caused by the liberals wanting to end the government's control of Mexico's natural resources and also to federalize the country once again. But don't be fooled. In our timeline, the liberals proved themselves to be just as authoritarian and corrupt as the conservatives, such as during the 31-year-long presidency of Porfirio Diaz. As this alternate reform war is being waged and Mexico's armies are distracted by the fighting in the core of the nation, whatever control Mexico still has over El Norte finally evaporates. Mexico's hold over El Norte was always tenuous at best, to the point where it's seriously worth questioning if El Norte was ever truly part of Mexico. The lines on the map might have said the land belonged to Mexico, but the on-the-ground reality never really reflected this. Once any kind of civil war breaks out in Mexico, the loss of its northern lands would become inevitable, with or without American intervention. The Tejanos see the Reform War as an opportunity and finally secede from Mexico and become an independent country. The British could seize California for themselves, which was a real concern President Polk had if the United States didn't act on Mexico first. What's left of El Norte by that point could be taken over by the Mormons and even fall back into the hands of native tribes. As for the outcome of this alternate reform war, I can't really be sure. Assuming the conservatives, being the pre-war establishment instead of the liberals, might be just enough to secure a win for the conservatives this time around, Mexico is left in ruins and the Mexican people are oppressed by a cruel and borderline theocratic regime backed by France. Assuming the liberals still win in this alternate timeline, the country is still in ruins, and the liberals will still decide to stop paying off Mexico's foreign debts, and France would still invade to install a puppet, Maximilian I, as Emperor of Mexico. Except this time around, the rump United States is unable to help Mexico defeat the French and the conservative collaborators by sending them guns and ammunition. Ultimately, the French succeed in their goal of puppeting Mexico, which would cease to be an independent country for decades to come. In an ironic twist of fate, in trying to prevent Mexico from losing half of its land, Mexico would not have only lost it anyway, but would have suffered just as much, if not more, in the process. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram. This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.